Hey everyone, my name's Trevor, and this is a fast-paced tutorial for writing video game dialogue using the open source scripting language called Ink. The best way to create dialogue with Ink is going to be by using Inkle's custom editor called Inky. You can download Inky from Inkle Studio's website, which I'll put in the description of this video. Once downloaded, you can launch the program, and you should see some sample dialogue. You can use the shortcuts Ctrl+ to make the text a bit bigger, and likewise Ctrl- to make it a bit smaller. The dialogue in an Ink file is referred to as a story. The left-hand side is the editor, which we can use to create the story, and on the right-hand side we can interact with the story that we're creating. We can then use the top arrows to go back by one step in our story, or go all the way back to the beginning of the story. As you can see, if we type some plain text, it'll show up as part of our story. Hitting enter will go to a new line, which also corresponds to a new line of our dialogue, as can be seen on the right. We can create what's called a comment by doing 2 forward slashes followed by some text. Comments won't show up as lines of dialogue, and they can be used to better document what you're doing or even temporarily disable parts of your story. As a shortcut, you can hold Ctrl and press the / key while on a line to comment or uncomment that line. If you want to comment out more than one line at once, you can use this syntax to create a block comment, where everything between these two markers won't show up as part of the story. If you go to the Ink dropdown in the top left, you can actually view sample syntax for some of the most fundamental things you can do with Ink. We'll start with what's called a knot. A knot represents a section of the story. It's declared by using these 3 equal signs on both sides of the knot's name. We'll call this knot main. As we can see on the right, it doesn't actually show up in the story yet. That's because we need to trigger it using something called a divert. We can go to Ink, Basic Structure, and Divert. We can see that a divert is declared by an arrow followed by the knot name that we want to go to. I'll change this to main, and now we can see the dialogue in our knot displayed on the right. As you might have guessed, you can think of end as a divert that's built into Ink that will end the story once used. You could also use the keyword done. While end ends the story in its entirety, done is meant to bring an end to a flow in your dialogue and doesn't necessarily have to bring an end to the entire story. We'll see a bit more on this later. Next, let's create a dialogue with a couple of choices. I'll start with some plain text, and then I'll go to Ink, Choices, Basic Choice, and then you can see that a basic choice is declared with this star character in front of the choice text. We'll make this choice be yes and add another choice to say no. Then we can add some text below each choice for the responses. Just to note, the indentation I'm doing here isn't at all required, but it just makes things a bit more readable. Now we can click through and see our choices play out. You'll notice that we see the text of the choice print out as well. If we don't want to print out the choice after we choose it, we can simply wrap it in brackets. As you can see, the choice no longer prints out after it's been chosen. You can also print out a variation of the choice. To do so, you wrap only part of the choice in brackets. The choice that's displayed will be everything up through the brackets, and the dialogue that's displayed after will be everything except for what's in the brackets. Now let's do something a bit more interesting. I'm going to create a knot called main with a question and 3 choices. Each choice is going to print out some text and then have a divert, which directs the story back to the main knot. By diverting back to the main knot, it'll send the dialogue back to the original question we posed, thus creating a loop for our dialogue. You'll notice that if we go through all of our choices, we get an error. This is because by default, these choices disappear after they've been chosen once, and after we've chosen them all, there's nothing else to show. One way to resolve this is by using a fallback choice. A fallback choice is executed automatically after all other choices have been chosen. To create a fallback choice, it's simply a choice with a divert arrow. Then, right below that, you can do whatever action you want to as the fallback choice. I'm just going to print out some text, but you could divert to another knot if you wanted to. We also need to include the end marker to properly end our story after it falls out of the choices flow. Now, after we exhaust all of our options, we can see that the fallback choice executes automatically. But perhaps you might not want the choices to disappear at all. If we want a choice to stick around, we can use what's called a sticky choice. The only difference is that we declare a sticky choice with a plus sign instead of a star. Now you can see that each choice is available as many times as we click it. Next, let's add a variable. If you go to Inc, Variables, you can see we have a couple of options: a global variable and a temp variable. A global variable is defined with var and can be accessed from anywhere within the story. A temp variable is scoped to the area which we declare it. So for example, if I declare it in the main knot, I won't be able to access it anywhere outside of that knot. There's one more kind of variable in Inc, and that's a constant. You can declare a constant with the word const. A constant is similar to a global variable, except a constant cannot be changed after it's been declared for the first time, whereas a global variable can. Variables can be anything from numbers to true or false values to text and even diverts. Let's create a global variable to store the Pokemon that we've chosen. It'll start as some empty text by setting the variable equal to these double quotes. Then when we make a choice, we'll change the variable. As you can see, if we just type out the variable assignment, Inc is going to treat that like plain text. To inform Inc that we want to modify this variable, we can put a tilde symbol in front of the statement. It's also important that the thing that we're assigning has quotations, as this tells Inc that Charmander is of type text and not another variable. Then, to print this variable out, we can simply wrap it in curly brackets. As you can see, now when we choose Charmander, the text displayed is actually using our variable. To clean things up a bit, I'm going to add another knot called chosen and direct each choice to call that knot instead of looping back to main. Then I can print out the Pokemon choice by using the global variable. Alternatively, instead of using a global variable to manage which Pokemon we've chosen, we can pass that information to the knot using a parameter. On the knot, we'll add parentheses followed by the variable name, which will be a temporary variable that can be passed in when we divert to the knot. Now in each of the diverts, we pass in the Pokemon name like so. This is simply another way to do the same thing we were doing previously, but some would argue this looks a bit nicer. Inc also has some more intermediate level syntax for writing stories that have an always forward direction, which most stories do. This syntax is called weave, and it introduces two new concepts: gathers and nested choices. In this example, we're asking a question followed by 4 choices. Once something has been chosen, we're printing out some text and then using the done marker to bring an end to that choice path. In our previous example, choosing a Pokemon, we didn't need the done marker because we were always diverting to another knot. Since we're not doing that in this example, the done marker lets Inc know that the choice has been completed and that the flow has finished. So you've probably noticed that the text is the same for each of these choices. We can use a gather to simplify this a bit. A gather is meant to bring the flow back together after it's been branched out by choices. We can declare a gather with a dash symbol followed by whatever we want to do after the flow comes back together. In this case, it makes sense to just print out that common text. When using a gather, it will detect when the choice has finished and execute based off of that. Because of that, we don't actually want to use the done marker anymore. Now, if we click through, you'll see that once any of the choices are selected and that choice path finishes, the dialogue is directed to the gather and we see that text printout. Gathers can come in really handy as your story flow gets more complicated. The other thing that Weave's syntax adds is the ability to create nested choices and nested gathers. When creating a nested choice, you simply add an extra star, or plus sign if it's a sticky choice, for each level that the choice is nested. Now, if we click through, our nested choices only show up after we've chosen the first choice. Likewise, we can nest gathers in a similar way, like so. You can now see that the nested gather will execute when the nested choices flow reaches an end, and the regular gather will only execute once the entire choices flow reaches an end. If this seems a bit confusing, don't worry too much. I'd encourage you to start writing dialogue without using Weave syntax, and as your dialogue becomes more complicated, you'll naturally discover the need for using it. Next, we'll look at handling conditional logic with Inc. I'm going to create a global variable called myVariable and set it to true. Then I'm going to go to Inc, inline logic, condition, and then change the variable to be myVariable. As you can see, the text that prints out is the first statement. If I change my variable to false, it'll print out the second statement. We can also change this to a number and actually compare it against another number. In this case, the first statement is written because my variable is less than 5. If your conditional statement is getting a bit long, or you need to do multiple things in it, there's a slightly different syntax for doing so. If I go to inc multi-line logic condition, we'll get this new syntax for dealing with conditionals. We can see that if the condition holds true, everything under the first block is executed, whereas if it's false, everything under the else block is executed. You can also do something called switch statements, which will take your variable and then map it to different cases. So in this example, since my variable is 2, we see the text 2 print out. If we change it to 5, we can see it enters the else case of the switch statement because we didn't have a previous case for it. You can also use conditionals to display choices, like in this example, where you can see the final choice isn't displayed because the condition is false. You can also perform math operations by wrapping the operation in curly brackets. For example, this line adds 5 and 3, which results in 8 being printed out in our dialog. To take this a step further, you can also define functions. The syntax for a function is similar to a not, except we use the keyword function followed by the name of the function, and then any parameters that we want it to take in within parentheses. Then we can use the tilde symbol and return keyword to return some value. And last, we call the function using its name and then passing in the parameter values. This is a simple function that adds 2 numbers and then returns the result, but functions can be as complicated as you want to make them. Inc also has a bunch of built-in functions that you can use. For example, the built-in function random will give you a random number inclusively between the parameters that you pass it. Or turns will return how many turns you've done in the dialog so far. Inc has a complete list of all of their built-in functions in their documentation. Now, if Inc doesn't have some specific functionality that you want to use, or you'd rather handle that functionality in code that's reading in this Inc file, for example C# code if you're going to be using Unity, you can use something called tags. When you tag a line with something using a hashtag, that data will be stored with the dialog line. When you're parsing that dialog line, this information is easily accessible. From there, you can parse and handle the data however you want to. In this example, these tags could be used to display the character's name who's speaking. You can have multiple tags for a single line, and the tags can be written on top of the line or to the side. The possibilities with this are limitless, since it really just comes down to how you're handling this in your video game's dialogue system. You can also define tags at the top of a not and then easily access them based on the not name, or even at the top of a file where they would be considered global tags that apply to the entire story. As the story gets bigger, you might want to do things to better organize it. One thing you can do is organize your not into what's called stitches. Stitches are created with one equal sign followed by the name. From outside the not, they can be called with a divert, which includes the not name, dot, the stitch name. From inside the not, you can simply divert to it using the stitch name. This is called a local divert. If you find your file is getting too big, you can also separate your story into multiple files and then import those files using the include statement. The Inky editor has a nice interface for creating new files and including them. We can expand this menu on the top left, go down to this plus sign to add a new file, enter the file name and keep this checkmark checked, then click Add. You can see that when we added the second file, an include statement was added to our main file. Now we'll just move this not into the new file and then we can divert to it in our main file, like so. The last thing I want to touch on involves localization. The good news is that Inc has no limitations for non-ASCII characters inside the story content. This means it can handle any characters you throw at it with one exception. That exception is that any variable names, not names, or other things built into Inc do have some limitations. If you plan on making your dialogue available in multiple languages, this is certainly something to keep in mind. There are also some more intermediate to advanced topics such as variable text, tunnels, threads, and advanced state tracking, which I believe you're better off learning as you find a need for them through writing your own dialogue. Anyways, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up so more people see it, and if you want to see more from me about game development and related topics, be sure to hit the subscribe button. But most of all, I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.